Humanity had been forgotten by the galaxy for centuries, pushed to the fringes, dismissed as too aggressive, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to be trusted with galactic affairs. The younger species who had never seen the old wars treated humans as relics of a violent past, a threat that had been wisely sidelined. Their stories were reduced to myths, their victories to cautionary tales. The stars moved on without them, or so everyone thought, while the Galactic Council expanded its reach, while trade, routes flourished and bureaucracies multiplied. The humans turned inward, not out of weakness but choice. They knew how they were perceived, they understood the fear and resentment, and instead of fighting it, they embraced the silence. They disappeared from the diplomatic halls and the battle maps, choosing solitude over forced submission. They built in the shadows, refining not just weapons but strategy. They trained generations in patience, in calculation, in discipline. War was no longer just a reaction. For them, it became a science. Every decision, every tactic, every innovation, tested, perfected, archived, and passed down to the next generation. They did not shout their strength. They let it simmer, waiting for the right moment, while the rest of the galaxy believed they had vanished. Humanity was sharpening its edge each forgotten year. Another layer of preparation and understanding, while others squabbled over territory and treaties. The humans studied those patterns, mapped those weaknesses, and when they looked out at the stars, they did not see enemies. They saw variables, they saw future battlefields not yet marked. And when the Cathron Empire began to rise, when their conquests spread like fire through the stars, and every proud species that once mocked humanity began to tremble again, it was not out of surprise. It was because deep down they remembered, even if they would not admit it, the truth was humanity had never lost its might. They had just buried it beneath layers of time and stillness. They had not forgotten the old ways, the ancient codes of war and survival. They had simply evolved them, the sword replaced by precision, the brute force replaced by knowledge. The humans had learned to move without being seen, to plan, without being noticed, to build without attracting attention. They became the storm that formed beyond the horizon, quiet and distant until the first lightning struck. And when the call for help came not from prideful allies, but from desperate former adversaries, humans did not hesitate. They listened, then they acted, and when the first fleets deployed, when those ships emerged from the void like echoes of a legend, the galaxy felt something it had not in generations. Fear, not the fear of unknown invaders, but the fear of something remembered, a power once witnessed and never truly understood. They were no longer just soldiers, they were tacticians, warriors who fought with purpose and silence. Each maneuver, each strike a message. The old ways live on, the forgotten might had not. Decayed, it had matured, it had waited, and now it had returned. The new generation bore no arrogance, only certainty. They had studied the past, inherited its lessons, and now wrote new ones with steel and fire. There was no need for declarations, no need to warn the galaxy. They simply showed up and let their actions speak in every system, reclaimed in every enemy fleet, shattered. The message was clear. We are still here, and we never stop being strong. While others debated protocol, humanity built contingency. While others formed councils, humanity trained commanders. And while the galaxy rested on peace that was always fragile, humans prepared for the moment that peace would break, and when it did, they moved with the force of inevitability. They reminded the stars that strength was not always loud, that silence often meant preparation, and that just because they were out of sight did not mean they were out of reach. The humans had never surrendered their legacy. They had preserved it, and now they delivered it with the precision of a race that knew exactly what it was capable of. They brought no gods, no monsters, only themselves. And that was enough. Their power did not lie in sheer numbers or overwhelming firepower. It lay in the conviction of those who had waited in the shadows, refining the art of war into something unstoppable. And as their fleets darkened the skies of those who once dismissed them, those enemies saw not a return of an ancient terror, but the rise of something new. Something evolved. The forgotten might of humanity was not a relic. It was a warning, a force too long underestimated, now fully awakened and ready to claim its rightful place among the stars. Once again, not as conquerors, but as a reckoning earned, not declared, built, not imposed, patient, not weak. It had always been there waiting sharpening, and now it would not be ignored ever again. For a time, the galaxy believed it had found peace. Treaties were signed, borders established, and conflicts buried under layers of diplomacy and distraction. The younger species ruled the council chambers, puffed with self-importance, claiming to have ushered in a new golden age without the need for the old warmongers, without the need for humanity. They celebrated their progress, blinded by pride and drunk on their temporary stability. But beneath the surface, old tensions festered, ancient grudges reignited, and political alliances proved weaker than anyone dared admit. The peace was never real. It was a pause, an illusion painted in soft words and fragile agreements. And when the Cathron dominion began to rise, no one was prepared. The Cathron were not newcomers. They had been watching, studying, expanding their reach with precision, disguised as diplomacy. They exploited every gap, every misstep, and soon they were no longer negotiating. They were conquering one star system at a time. Their tactics were brutal, efficient, their rule absolute. They did not ask for loyalty, they demanded obedience. Entire civilizations vanished under their war machine. Species, once proud and independent, became vassals trembling under reptilian boots. The council hesitated, clung to protocol as if procedure could hold back an empire they formed. Committees issued condemnations, but nothing stopped. The Cathron tide worlds fell screaming, and still the council believed they could contain it. They sent fleets pieced together from disparate allies under commanders with no unity, no strategy. And every time they engaged the Cathron, they were crushed. The truth settled slowly like poison in the veins. The galaxy was losing, and losing badly. The ones who had dismissed humanity, the ones who had pushed them to the edge, now found themselves outmatched, outmaneuvered, and out of time. Whispers began in the darkened corridors of diplomacy, names spoken in caution and quiet desperation. Do the humans still have ships? Did they keep their weapons? Are they still capable of war? No one knew for sure because no one had dared to ask in generations. But desperation breeds humility, and one by one, envoys began to reach out, first through unofficial channels, then more openly, messages sent through old frequencies. Eyes once filled with scorn, now filled with fear. They asked for contact, they asked for talks, but what they truly asked for was protection, for salvation. Not from a benevolent force, but from the one power they once exiled. They asked if the war masters of Earth still remembered how to fight. They asked if the rumors were true that human fleets still trained in secret, that their weapons had only grown deadlier over time. And slowly the silence was broken. Earth began to respond not with speeches or threats, but with questions of their own. How many systems had fallen? How much time was left? And who exactly was asking for their help? It was not pride that delayed their answer. It was calculation. Humanity had always been careful, always measured, and this was no exception. They gathered intelligence, studied movements, ran simulations, and while the council bickered and the Cathron advanced, the humans were preparing one last time, deciding when and how to return. Not as volunteers, but as a last resort. The galaxy had changed, but the rules had not, in the face of annihilation. Even the proudest species would kneel, and as the Cathron took another system, as their ships blotted out another sun, the council finally acted. They sent the official request to Earth. It was not a declaration, it was a surrender of ego. It was an admission that everything they had built, without humanity, had failed. The message carried no pretense. No demand, only a simple plea. We need your help. And on the orbital stations above Earth, in the war rooms, deep beneath the surface, that message was read, understood, and accepted by those who had waited for this moment, not in bitterness, but in readiness. They did not respond with celebration or vengeance. They responded with movement orders, issued fleets, assembled weapons once locked away, now loaded and primed, and for the first time in centuries, Earth prepared for war, not because they sought glory, but because they knew what was at stake. They saw the galaxy crumbling under its own arrogance, and they knew it was time to act again. The veterans who remembered the last wars returned to command the new generation, trained in silence, now ready to write history of their own. The galaxy had come full circle. Once it had exiled its guardians, and now it came back begging for their return, not because it respected them, but because it feared what would happen without them. And in that moment, humanity answered not with promises, but with presence. The ships rose, the engines burned, and the stars began to shift as something ancient returned to the battlefield. Not with fury, but with focus. They had not been forgotten. They had simply waited, and now the galaxy remembered not through words, but through action. The Catherine would soon learn, as the others had before them, that when humanity returns to war, they do not return as an army, they return as a reckoning, not to conquer, but to restore balance, not to dominate, but to remind the stars that some powers cannot be erased, only delayed, and now the delay was over. When the order finally came, it was delivered without fanfare. No media, no speeches, no parades, just a quiet confirmation transmitted through secure channels. The mission was greenlit, and the fleet was to mobilize. Every officer who read that message understood what it meant. Humanity was returning to the battlefield not as a scattered force of defenders, but as a unified machine built for precision, dominance, and control. The orbital stations lit up with activity. Veterans and rookies moved in lockstep, following protocols that had not been used in centuries, but had never been forgotten within hours. Hangars that had lain dormant rumbled to life. Massive carriers powered up systems that gleamed with cold efficiency. Assault ships slid into formation. Weapons diagnostics ran without error, and command protocols were reaffirmed as if they had been used yesterday, not generations ago. The Terran insignia, the star and sword once feared across the stars, was stamped on every hull, restored and polished to perfection. The chain of command was clear. At the top stood the old guard men, like Gareth and James, who had seen the last days of galactic conflict, and below them stood a new generation, led by commanders like Marcus, handpicked for this very moment, not because of legacy, but because of readiness. Their strategies were not born in academies, but forged in simulation under the tutelage of those who had learned war through fire. Their minds were sharp, their vision clear, and they understood the gravity of what they were about to do. The objective was simple: strike fast, strike hard. Remind the galaxy that humanity was not a relic, but a reckoning. The fleet moved in coordinated silence, ships launching in waves, each one perfectly timed, each maneuver rehearsed to the point of instinct. No music, no noise, only the hum of engines and the quiet tension of purpose. The deployment was surgical. Every ship assigned a role, every pilot briefed, every gunner locked into the rhythm of a machine. Greater than any one person from orbit Earth watched its children leave again. Not in mourning, but in recognition of necessity. They had waited, they had watched, and now they had chosen the moment to act, and act they would. The jump to hyperspace was smooth, calculated. The coordinates fed through systems that had been refined over generations. They did not aim for spectacle. They aimed for results, and as the fleet emerged into contested space, their arrival was met with silence. The enemy did not know they were coming until it was too late. The Cathron Dominion had grown accustomed to easy victories. Their fleets had crushed opposition without real resistance for so long that discipline had faded into arrogance. They believed no force could match their firepower. No tactic could outmaneuver their strength. But they had not fought humans, not truly. And now they, with their outposts, fell first, quick and without warning. Human ships struck from angles. The Cathron defenses were never built to withstand their jamming systems, disabled communications. Their stealth tech bypassed scanners, and their targeting algorithms operated with brutal accuracy. It was not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. The humans were not testing the waters. They were reclaiming control sector by sector, system by system. The fleet advanced like a wave that never broke its pattern, only adapted, refined, improved. Every encounter was a lesson. Every maneuver sharpened. And as word began to spread across the stars, old fears resurfaced, whispers of Earth's return, of the Terran war machine, reigniting stories that had once been dismissed as myths but were now unfolding in real time. For those watching from the sidelines, it was a revelation. For those in the path of the fleet, it was a nightmare. The Catherans scrambled to react, but their strategies were outdated, designed for predictable resistance, not the cold, relentless advance of a force trained for silence and precision. Their ships clustered together, tried to regroup, But each formation was dissected by human tactics, flanked, dissected, dismantled with precision that bordered on mechanical. There were no random movements, no blind charges. Every decision had purpose, and every strike left a message. We are back. The humans made no demands. They gave no ultimatums. They simply advanced, letting their actions deliver the OEU, warning that diplomacy had failed and now consequences had come. It was not vengeance. It was justice executed with restraint. But without hesitation, commanders issued orders with clarity. Their crews responded with discipline, and the entire fleet moved as one living entity, each part dependent on the others, each moment synchronized to perfection, and above it all, the calm, unshakable voice of Marcus guided the charge. His focus never drifting, his presence anchoring the bridge while chaos unfolded. Beyond the viewport, he did not need to inspire his people. They were already driven by something greater, legacy, purpose, and the understanding that they were the only thing standing between collapse and survival in command rooms across allied worlds. Leaders watched the live feeds in silence, some with hope, others with fear, but all with recognition that the humans had returned not as a broken faction, but as a force of nature. Their precision was not showmanship. It was the result of centuries of preparation, of cultures forged through hardship and sacrifice, of doctrines written not on paper, but in blood and memory. And now that doctrine was being read aloud through battle formations and kinetic fire across the stars. The campaign was not a single battle. It was a statement, a series of calculated operations that reshaped the balance of power, one engagement at a time. And as the flagship led the charge deeper into contested space, the humans did not slow. They did not waver, because this was not revenge, this was responsibility. And every captain, every soldier, every technician understood that they were not here for glory. They were here to restore balance, to remind the galaxy that peace built on exclusion was a lie, and that true stability required strength, not arrogance. And in that strength, humanity had never faltered, only waited, and now the wait was over. The Kethran Dominion had never expected to be challenged, not truly, not by anyone. They had grown too confident in their dominance, too used to the fear that followed their name across the stars. Their fleets were massive, their weapons unmatched, or so they believed. But what they had failed to understand was that overwhelming force without adaptability was nothing more than a blunt instrument. They had relied on brute strength, on intimidation, on the belief that no one would dare to stand against them. And that belief shattered the moment the human fleet arrived. Their arrival was not announced with grand speeches or threats. It came in silence, a sudden calculated presence on the battlefield, ships emerging from hyperspace, in precise formations, weapons, prime systems, synchronized. The Kethran scanners could not identify the newcomers. At first, their signatures were unfamiliar, their movements too coordinated to be pirates, too aggressive to be diplomats. And then the first wave struck. It was not a warning shot, it was a decapitation strike, targeting Kethran command ships with surgical accuracy. Kinetic rounds and energy blasts cut through shields and hulls like paper, entire formations torn apart before they could even return fire on the Kethran flagship. High Marshal Kesh watched in disbelief as his forward lines crumbled within minutes. Alarms blared. Officers shouted data flowed in too fast to process. The enemy had bypassed their jamming systems, had ignored their hail, and now was dismantling their fleet one ship at a time. Kesh barked orders, but his voice held uncertainty, a crack in the iron control that had ruled so many systems with fear. The enemy was moving faster than anything they had ever seen, striking from angles they had not accounted for, anticipating their reactions before they even made them. They tried to counterattack, sent volleys of fire into the void, hoping to catch the humans off guard. But nothing landed. Every Kethran response was already accounted for. Every tactic already neutralized. It was as if the humans had fought this battle before. And in many ways, they had not this exact one, but every scenario, every possible engagement drilled into their systems, into their minds, into their command structures. They did not improvise, they executed. They did not react, they controlled. Marcus stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship, eyes locked on the tactical display. He did not shout, he did not gloat. He issued commands in a calm, steady voice, and his crew followed with the same precision they had trained for their entire lives to the Aether. It looked like chaos, ships moving too fast too, aggressively, but in truth, it was a pattern. A web of actions perfectly interlinked and unfolding across space, like a symphony of destruction. Their ships were not just weapons. They were instruments playing a song of calculated dominance, one that the Aether had no answer for. Their formations broke their lines. Collapsed entire squadrons vanished under relentless barrages, and still, the humans did not stop. They adapted with each moment, shifting formations, adjusting, targeting, reallocating energy. The Aether were reacting, the humans were orchestrating. Kesh watched as his dreadnought shuddered under another impact systems, failing alarms screeching. His officers looked to him for guidance, but he had none. He could see it in their eyes, the fear, the doubt, the slow realization that they were not fighting rebels or pirates or unruly neighbors. They were fighting humanity, and humanity did not fight to win. They fought to finish. The tide had turned, not with numbers, but with intent, with preparation. And now the Aether war machine, once so feared, so ruthless, was being unraveled piece by piece across the battlefield. Survivors fled or surrendered. Those who stayed were annihilated, not through malice, but through precision. It was not rage driving the humans. It was discipline, the kind of discipline that had been forged in silence over centuries of preparation. While the rest of the galaxy forgot them, they had remembered every slight, every betrayal, every dismissal, and they had turned it into fuel, not for revenge, but for focus, for effectiveness. The Aether tried to regroup, formed a defensive ring around their flagship, but the humans flanked them, used coordinated attacks to break the formation into segments, isolated and destroyed each one, until there was nothing left but fragments burning in the void. One by one, the enemy signals vanished and the battlefield grew quieter. Not peaceful, just silent, the silence that comes only after overwhelming force has spoken, and there is no one left to argue. Marcus observed the wreckage, his eyes unwavering, his voice calm, as he gave the final command: target the flagship and end this. The barrage that followed was not excessive, it was exact. It tore through the Aether dreadnought in precise strikes, disabling propulsion, destroying weapon systems, crippling command nodes until the once mighty vessel was a drifting husk, and on its bridge Kesh stood frozen, watching the empire he had built collapse around him. His claws gripped the console, his mouth formed words of denial, but in his heart he knew it was over. He had faced many enemies in his lifetime, but never one like this. Never one so quiet, so thorough, so unstoppable. The human fleet did not cheer. They did not broadcast their victory. They simply continued with their mission, securing the sector, re-establishing control, leaving no doubt in anyone watching that the age of Aether supremacy was over. Not because of politics or alliances, but because a force greater than fear had returned and shown them what true power looked like on the burning bridge of the Aether flagship. High Marshal Kesh stood frozen as firelight flickered across the shattered remains of his command center. Panels sparked, consoles screamed, and his officers scrambled in vain to regain control. But the truth had already settled like cold steel in his chest. There was nothing left to command. The fleet was gone. The formation that had once symbolized unbreakable strength had been reduced to drifting wreckage and scattered cries. For help, he had underestimated them, all of them, every world that sent the humans a plea for help, every whisper of their return, every warning ignored in favor of arrogance. And now his empire paid the price. The screens in front of him no longer showed battle, just destruction, red markers fading into black static, as ships either exploded or surrendered one by one until only a handful remained. Limping, powerless, desperate, they had tried to retreat, had even sent a command to regroup at a fallback position, but the fallback line no longer existed. It had been obliterated before it could be established, cut off by human strike teams that had anticipated every move before it happened, and now Kesh had nothing left but the failing hull beneath his feet. He could feel the dreadnought groan around him, bulkheads creaking, systems overloading. Every breath tasted like smoke. Every order he gave fell on ears too. Overwhelmed by panic to respond, He was no longer a leader. He was a symbol of failure. And as another explosion rocked the deck, he stumbled, gripping the rail as if it could anchor him to a reality that was slipping away. His vision blurred, his chest heaved with rage and disbelief. This was not how it was supposed to end. They were the Kethran. They ruled through strength, through terror. They were supposed to be unstoppable. And yet here he stood, watching his legacy shatter into stardust. He opened a channel one last time, tried to reach the remaining captains, his voice hoarse, demanding a final stand. But there was only static silence, or the soft, broken voices of those surrendering, without permission, without pride, without options, across the remains of the fleet. The story was the same. Crews abandoned their weapons, sent surrender codes, and raised power signals, desperate to survive. What had become an undeniable truth they had lost, and they had lost to an enemy. They believed extinct, a power they had written off as outdated, irrelevant, even gone. And now that enemy stood over them, not with banners or boasts, but with silent precision and unmatched control on the human flagship. Marcus watched the final surrender come through, data confirmed transmissions, log signatures verified. He gave a single nod and turned to his officer's report. He said, his voice steady, minimal damage across all units. Sir, no confirmed losses, all ships operational and accounted for. Marcus let that sit for a moment, not in celebration, but in reflection. The enemy had been powerful, numerous, relentless. But and none of that mattered, not when faced with a force that had made war into a science, not when faced with humanity. Gareth leaned back at his console, rubbing his eyes slowly, tired but composed well. That went better than expected. James chuckled softly. We knew it would. They never stood a chance, not once we got serious, and there it was. The truth they all understood. The Kethran had believed they could crush anything through numbers and force, but they had never accounted for experience, for preparation, for the kind of cold discipline that humanity had developed during its exile. And now the evidence of that mistake drifted lifeless in space. Burning hulls, broken chains of command, abandoned dreadnoughts that no longer inspired fear, but served as monuments to failure on the Kethran flagship. High Marshal Kesh fell to his knees as the floor beneath him trembled. The final barrage had struck home. The final systems failed. The command deck shuddered as artificial gravity flickered and lights died. He looked up one last time through the cracked viewport, watching the distant silhouettes of human ships holding position, motionless in victory. They did not advance. They did not fire again. They simply waited, watching until the last threat was gone. And in that stillness, he understood they had not come to conquer. They had come to end him, and they had succeeded. He closed his eyes, clenched his fists, and whispered, not in defiance, but in confusion. How could this happen? And then came the light, the roar, the final impact as the dreadnought was torn apart from within its core. Overloaded, its structure collapsed, and its legacy erased in one flash of fire. The High Marshal was no more the symbol of Kethran's strength, turned to dust, and as the wreckage drifted into space, the rest of the fleet surrendered completely. Weapons ejected, systems powered down, transmissions filled with desperate pleas for mercy. But the humans were not cruel. They did not demand suffering. They accepted the surrenders with efficiency, processed the signals, locked the ships in with containment fields, and moved on. No victory speech. No triumphant declaration, only silence and order. Professionalism that carried more weight than any grand gesture. And across the galaxy, eyes were watching leaders and civilians alike. Every species that had doubted humanity now saw what they had become, what they had always been, and what they had chosen not to unleash until now. The surrender of the Kethran Dominion was not just a military outcome. It was a shift in galactic memory, a reminder that those who step away do not always do so in weakness, and that the quiet ones may be the ones who strike hardest when the time comes. On the command bridge, Marcus stood tall, his expression unreadable, his voice calm. Send the report, he said. Tell the council the Kethran Dominion is finished, and tell them what we did. Here was just the beginning. The officers nodded. Transmissions sent, protocols updated. The mission was complete. The galaxy would never be the same again. There was no celebration on the bridge of the human flagship, no music, no cheers, no emotional outbursts, only the quiet mechanical rhythm of professionals completing a mission they had prepared for their entire lives. The crew moved with precision, securing systems, running diagnostics, maintaining formation as if what they had just done was routine, as if defeating the most feared empire in the galaxy was merely the fulfillment of an expected outcome. And in a way this was not a victory born out of luck or desperation. It was the product of calculated readiness, refined over centuries while the rest of the galaxy had played politics. Humanity had studied warfare, while others grew fat on false peace. Humans had turned silence into strength, and now that strength had spoken loud and clear, not through words but through undeniable results. Gareth leaned forward, resting his elbows on the console, his eyes scanning the tactical display filled with the remnants of the enemy fleet, debris fields, escape pods, disabled ships, and surrender signals, all accounted for, all under control. He let out a breath, not of relief but of release, like an old burden finally shifting off his shoulders. James stood beside him, arms crossed. Calm, steady as always, he had not cracked a smile since the first shot was fired. He did not need to. They had not come for revenge. They had come because someone had to. Marcus remained at the center of the bridge, eyes fixed on the viewport where the battlefield stretched across space, lit only by the glow of wreckage and engine trails. In the distance, he gave no speech, issued no final line of triumph. He simply observed, and when the last system check came through and the final confirmations arrived, he nodded once and gave the only order that mattered. "Initiate retreat," he said, and the command echoed through the fleet with a hum of engines and a flash of hyperspace signatures. The Terran fleet began to withdraw, not in panic, not in haste, but in perfect formation. Every ship accounted for every pilot still breathing. It was not a retreat of fear, but a withdrawal of completion. The mission had been executed, the threat neutralized. There was no reason to stay. The stars did not need monuments, and humanity did not need applause. This was not about legacy or pride. This was about restoring balance. And now that it had been done, they left without asking for anything in return. The Allied ships that had watched from the periphery, unsure whether to intervene or flee now, stood still. Transmissions flooded in messages of gratitude, disbelief, awe, and even fear. The Council sent their official statement, words of thanks and relief wrapped in diplomacy. But buried within was something more, something unspoken. The realization that the force they had once rejected had now saved them, and the quiet question of what that force might do next. Marcus read the message silently, then forwarded it to the archive without response. There was nothing else to say. The work was finished for now across the fleet. The mood remained the same, focused, restrained, professional. The young soldiers who had joined this mission, full of questions and secondhand stories, now carried the weight of experience. The veterans who had waited decades to be called back into service now stood vindicated, not by public approval, but by the precision of their execution. No one spoke of glory, no one spoke of victory. They spoke of readiness, of responsibility, of what might come next, because the galaxy had seen what they were capable of, and no one would ever forget it again. On one of the lower decks, a group of engineers stood in silence, watching the last of the enemy signals vanish from their monitors. One of them, a young recruit no older than 20, muttered softly, "They really didn't stand a chance, did they?" His supervisor shook his head. "Not once we committed. Not once we showed up." And that was the truth. The enemy had lost the moment humanity had decided to act. The battle was just confirmation, and now that confirmation drifted through space as cold evidence of what silence can create when given time. The stars would remember this not just as a battle, but as a turning point, a shift in how power was understood, no longer measured in numbers or political seats, but in capability and resolve. And as the fleet vanished into the black, returning to the outer systems of Earth, they carried no trophies, no prisoners, no claims. They carried only the knowledge that when they are needed, they will come. And when they come, they do not ask, they do not hesitate. They deliver the results, and then they go back to waiting, not because they are unsure, but because they understand. Timing is everything. Gareth stood at the observation window, hands in his pockets, eyes tracking the retreating ships. He did not speak for a long time. And when he finally did, it was barely above a whisper. Quiet missions, quiet exits. I could get used to that. James beside him gave a small nod. Never needed noise, he said, just purpose. And now they had fulfilled it. The hangars welcomed the returning ships with efficiency. Teams moved into place to refuel, rearm, and record the after-action data. No ceremony, just order, just structure, as if they had never left, as if they had always been ready for this moment. And in truth, they had, because this was never about making an entrance. This was about reminding the galaxy that the silence of humanity is not weakness, it is warning. And when that warning is ignored, what follows is not chaos, it is control, clean, precise, final. And now the galaxy knew it, and they would not forget it again. Across the galaxy, in every council chamber, on every command bridge, and inside every war room, eyes were fixed on the aftermath of the battle. Not because they had expected victory, but because they had expected failure. What they saw instead was something they were not prepared for. They saw the Kethran Dominion shattered not through prolonged war or alliance, maneuvering but by a single force, a single fleet that moved with such precision and efficiency, it rewrote everything they thought they knew about power and control in the galaxy. The humans had returned, and they had not returned as beggars or relics. They had returned as professionals with a level of discipline and technological superiority that stunned even their harshest critics. The species who had long dismissed Earth as a forgotten corner of an old war now scrambled to understand what they had just witnessed. Their analysts pored over every sensor log, every communication record, every piece of battlefield data, hoping to find a weakness, a clue, some sign that this victory had been a fluke. But there was none. What they found instead was consistency. Every maneuver, every strike, every command had been executed with near mathematical perfection. The Terran fleet had not stumbled into success. They had engineered it. They had controlled the tempo of the battle from the moment they arrived and never once relinquished that control. And as these realizations spread, so too did something else, something deeper than awe, more enduring than fear. Respect, not the kind earned through diplomacy or trade, but the kind forged in fire and proven by results. The kind that reshapes alliances and rewrites military doctrine. The kind that makes entire civilizations reconsider where true power lies and who they want standing beside them if another war ever comes. The Council issued a second transmission, this one not of thanks but of intent. They wanted to open discussions with Earth, formal ones, to re-establish ties, to build new treaties. But behind every line of diplomatic language there was a new tone, a cautious one, because they had seen what happened when humanity got serious, and no one wanted to be on the receiving end of that. Ever again, the smaller species, the ones who had once looked to the Council for protection, now looked to Earth and its fleet, wondering if perhaps they had chosen the wrong. Allies long ago, wondering what might have happened if they had embraced humanity instead of exiling them. Many of them began to send messages of their own, not through official channels but through private ones. Invitations, offers, gestures of cooperation, offers to share resources, to open trade, to participate in training exchanges. Some even sent requests for security assistance, thinly veiled behind joint operation proposals. They no longer saw Earth as unstable or dangerous. Now they saw it as a force that could not only end wars but prevent them. And with that perception came fear as well, because if a fleet of that size could do what it had just done, then what else could they be capable of? And more importantly, what would happen if humanity ever decided to stop holding back? The galaxy had always feared chaos. And in their fear, they had exiled the one species capable of controlling it. And now the truth was undeniable. Earth had not disappeared. It had been watching and waiting, preparing, and now that it had acted, no one could pretend otherwise. No one could say they were irrelevant. No one could say they were unneeded. Humanity had been sidelined. And yet, when everything fell apart, they were the only ones who could fix it. And they had done so not with arrogance, but with certainty, with quiet resolve and unmatched skill. And now the entire galaxy knew exactly what that meant. They knew that the old stories were not just myths, that the fear once associated with the Terran insignia had not been propaganda, but memory, and those memories had returned more vivid than ever before. Governments began to meet behind closed doors, revising military policy, rethinking border strategy, redrawing contingency plans, all while trying to calculate just how far Earth was willing to go, how much influence they would now hold, and how quickly that influence would grow. Some feared retaliation, feared that humanity might seek revenge for the centuries of dismissal. But they had seen no signs of that. No speeches of dominance, no threats, no demands. Earth had come, did its job, and left as if the battle had never been about recognition or power at all, but simply about responsibility. And that made the fear even stronger because no one knew what motivated them. Now, no one knew what line had to be crossed for humanity to return again. But they all knew one thing for certain: if that line was ever crossed, the result would be swift, decisive, and final. For the first time in centuries, Earth had reminded the galaxy not just of who they were, but of what they could do. And from this moment forward, no one would ever forget it again. The fleet returned to its space silently, each ship pulling into formation as though the mission had been just another exercise. The crew aboard every vessel carried the same expression, one of controlled focus with no sign of pride, no hint of superiority. Only the clarity of those who had seen the face of destruction and chosen to prevent it, not with bravado, but with execution. This was not the first time humanity had intervened in a galactic crisis, but it was the first time in generations that they had done so after being abandoned by those they once defended, and yet they had not hesitated. They had not closed the door to those who had closed it on them. Instead, they watched, they prepared, and when the call came, they responded not with resentment, but with resolve. The galaxy had been reminded that strength is not always loud, and power does not always demand attention. Sometimes the most dangerous force is the one that waits and watches, and when it moves, it does so with certainty, because it understands timing better than anyone. The younger species had grown used to the idea that peace was permanent, that war was a thing of the past. They built treaties instead of defenses, trusted alliances over preparation. But peace is never guaranteed, and when it fractures, only those who remained ready can hold the line. Humanity did not return to prove a point. They returned because the alternative was letting an entire civilization collapse into fear and chaos, and when they acted, they did so with a weight that came not from hate, but from experience. They had seen what happens when power is left unchecked, and they refused to let it happen again. Now that the battle was over and the stars were calm once more, a new question spread quietly across the galaxy. Would the humans stay? Would they begin to reshape the balance of power? Would they seek influence over those who once cast them aside? But Earth remained quiet. There were no occupation forces, no demands for political control. The fleet simply faded into the darkness, returning to the edge of known space, leaving behind only memory and data. And that memory was enough to shift how entire worlds viewed security, enough to make arrogant powers question their assumptions, and enough to ensure that the name of humanity would once again carry meaning. Not because of destruction, but because of restraint. The most powerful message humanity had sent was not the destruction of the Kethren. It was the silence that followed. No boasting, no celebration, no threats, only the evidence of what had happened and the promise that if needed, it would happen again. It was that quiet efficiency that unsettled those who watched the most because it revealed something deeper than strength. It revealed control, and in a galaxy built on fear and dominance, control is the most dangerous trait of all. The humans had not just won a battle, they had redefined the terms of galactic stability, and in doing so, they forced every species to reevaluate what it meant to be safe and who they could trust. There were some who still whispered warnings, who feared what humanity might do next. But there were many more who saw them as a stabilizing force. Not perfect, not pure, but consistent, a force that could be counted on. Not for politics, but for results in the days that followed. Messages continued to arrive from distant systems, some seeking alliances, others offering apologies. A few simply expressed respect. None of them were ignored, but none of them received promises either. The Terran response was the same in every case. We do not act for glory. We act because it must be done. And that message spread faster than any weapon and cut deeper than any threat. It reminded every leader, every strategist, every diplomat that there are forces in the galaxy which do not need permission to be relevant. Forces that exist not to take control, but to ensure it does not fall into the wrong hands. And in the quiet that followed, as embassies reopened and councils debated, the deeper lesson of what had just occurred began to sink in. Humanity had proven that strength is not defined by appearance or presence, but by preparation, and while they had shown that patience is a weapon and silence, a shield, that timing matters more than numbers, and resolve more than reputation. And in that lesson, there was something the galaxy had almost forgotten. Something that mattered not just in space, but here on Earth as well. A reminder that in our own world, in our own time, it is easy to forget those who choose silence over spectacle. It is easy to dismiss those who work in the background, who build without recognition, who stand ready not for applause but for necessity. But those are the ones who make the difference when the moment comes. Those are the ones who lead not by position, but by purpose in every society. In every time, there will always be those who prepare in silence and wait in patience. And it is often those who are overlooked who change the course of history when it matters most. The story of humanity's return to the galactic stage is not just a tale of ships and battles. It is a lesson in humility, in foresight, in the value of being ready, even when the world tells you to stand down. It reminds us that the measure of a people is not how loud they speak, but how they act when silence is no longer enough. And in that moment, when the stars cried out for help, it was the quiet force, the forgotten ones who answered and changed everything.